the journey that led to this book, it started in earnest when I was a teenager. And there was this thing roiling within me. And it finally required expression when I was 18. So at the age of 18, I was poised on this fork in the road of my life. And one fork actually led to U of T, where I'd been accepted to study physics. And I was in the thrall of the mysteries of quantum mechanics. What was this universe that was my universe that so defied everything I knew about the world? The other fork in the road also led to a mystery of a very different sort. I was passionate about theater. Actually, at the age of 16, I joined a theater company in downtown Toronto called the Garrett Theatre on Yonge Street, near Isabella, if I'm remembering. And there was a director, John Herbert, who'd written a play, Fortune in Men's Eyes, that at the time was the most successful Canadian play that had ever appeared. And translated, performed all over the country. And it was like on the third floor of where the Brick Shirt Warehouse is. And at 16, I'd head downtown, and I grew up in the suburbs, so head downtown was so exciting, and up and studying theater with a passion. I could feel my life cracking open as I'm engaging with the vital life that happens on a stage. Well, my interest in theater led me to read about world theater, and one of the theaters I read about is Japanese No theater. Now, Japanese No theater, what I read was like a succinct distillation of everything that needed to be said about theater almost, and just in a few pages. And I almost memorized this little, there was a secret treatise that was translated into English. And No theater originated in the 1300s. I mean, it originated in the time of Chaucer and has survived to this day intact without being changed. And a No play was coming to Montreal. So I'm now 17. This No play is coming. I get on a Greyhound bus. I take the trip to Montreal, and I slept in a flop house because it was so cheap. My memory is it was $1.25 for the night. So $1.25, sign me up, that's my budget. So I climb up and I get into this room of beds with tubercular men coughing themselves to sleep. Okay, the next night I wasn't there. But I did see this No play, and it radically changed my life. I was reduced to tears by the beauty of it, by the restrained power of it. And I had no idea how it had had that effect on me. I couldn't even begin to parse it. I was pretty good at parsing theater, and I'd seen, by that point, I'd been to England, and I'd seen John Gielgud and Ralph Richardson in a play called Home. It's stunning, like the best that the West could offer, and I could tell you why it worked to some extent. The No play, no idea how it had reduced me to tears as it had. So here I am at this fork in the road, physics at U of T or Japan. And I didn't have any money to speak of, but being 18, I had this reasoning faculty that suggested that if I went to England and bought a bicycle and got on the bike and started pedaling. And if I was headed in the right direction and I didn't stop pedaling, I'd get to Japan. And it turns out I was sort of right. So I left home and was gone for 2 years and cycled through Europe and the Middle East and India and Japan. It wasn't just no theater that propelled me on that journey. I had to get out of my culture. I became acutely aware in my teens of how deeply instructed I had been in how to think, how to look, what to think about, what is good, what is bad, what is up, what is down. I mean, what is up, what is down may seem like, what are you talking about? But no, in our culture, up is good and down is bad. That's a cultural value. It's like we want to dissociate from the earth and aspire up, up, up. So, oh, you're looking up today. He's looking a little down. There's no ambiguity within our language about what that means. In another culture, you're looking up could mean you're looking kind of disconnected from the earth. You're looking down could mean you look like you're at peace with yourself and at rest on the planet. It's a cultural bias. And these patterns of thinking and being had seeped into me as it seeps into every one of us. It's like you absorb your culture and it lives in your neurology as normal, not just as normal, as reality. So every culture is a sort of story about what it means to be human. And we are told over and over by our culture what it means to be human. And I could feel myself bound in that. And it's like I felt the adults around me had bought into a fantasy. And it's like beseeching me to come join the fantasy. It's, you'll do well here. And I'm like, no, that would kill me. And I didn't know the nature of the fantasy, but I knew that if I remained within my culture, I would be subsumed, and something very, very vital within me would perish. So I left on my bike, and I passed through so many different ways of understanding what it means to be human. And every single culture I passed through, that the story about what it means to be human was luminous, and every story was limited. And by the time I got back after 2 years, I had acquired the ability to ask questions of my culture. And, I walked in, it's the strangest thing, after 2 years, I was now 20, coming back into my neighborhood, my life. And it's like, boy, these people are strange. Customs that I'd habituated to suddenly looked bizarre by contrast. And when I was in Japan, I discovered why I'd been unable to parse, to take apart, to understand the power of no theater. Because I came in contact with the Japanese concept of Hara. Hara is a Japanese word, it means belly. But to think that it's equivalent to the English word belly is to be guilty of a grave mistake. Hara in the Japanese language, the belly, is the seat of your profoundest understanding. It's where you come home to yourself. It's where you discover your deepest truth. And in no theater, every gesture arose from that place. I'd never seen that before. I had no way to orient myself to it. I felt the power of it. But I'd never seen a head turn from there. I'd never seen an arm raised from there. It was a different way of being. And I learned that, it's not just the Japanese culture. It's in China, they speak of the belly as the mind palace. In the Incan culture, it's funny, the capital of the Incan nation was Cusco. Now, Cusco means belly button. That is their center. Our word capital means head. That is our center. Right? I mean, it couldn't be more patent. It's not just a difference of language, it's a difference of experience. And that whole journey, when I look back at what triggered my understanding, my feeling that these adults around me were just milling about in a fantasy land. Where I grew up was like on the cusp of suburbia. It was actually York Mills and Bayview. But I remember cows grazing at the corner of York Mills and Bayview when it was a 2-lane road, and Winfield's farm was right there. I'd deliver my newspapers in the morning. I could hear the horses thundering by. And 2 streets over at the end of the street was a dead end. And there was a spring-fed creek and this ravine that was just wild. And I would like gravitate there and spend hours there in the lushness of this world. And the red-winged blackbirds, when I hear a red-winged blackbird today, the cry just thrills through my being. And I felt an intimacy, a companionship, and a mystery. And there was, this ravine was locally known as Pollywog's Paradise. And there was a place where there was sinking sand. And, this image as a kid of, boy, if you really stepped into there, you could just disappear, which of course wasn't true. And it was reality. It was a reality that was so much more tangible to me than the suburban houses that lined my street. And then I watched as the adults came and buried this spring-fed creek in a sewer and covered it over with dirt and clipped grass. And it's like, all right, for sure, it beyond any doubt, adults are insane. It was just so clear to me. And it's funny because I looked at my passport the other day, the passport I took on this journey, and the date I left Canada was November 24th, 1971. It's like almost exactly 46 years ago. It just kind of resonates with Radical Wholeness appearing, 46 years after this crazy heading off. And my mom, I have 2 daughters, one of whom is here this evening. And they turn 18. I'm looking at my 18-year-old daughter thinking of how did my mom stand on the front porch and wave goodbye to me. And I'm saying, bye, Mom, I'm going to go cycle to Japan. All right, see you later. Anyway, she just somehow, deep, deep in her soul, understood that I had to do this. And so I encountered this concept of Hara and found it in other cultures and found it, There's a great Zen philosopher, D.T. Suzuki, who writes about this, these anthropologists who are encountering this Aboriginal tribe, and the Aboriginal tribe finds out that the anthropologists think with their heads. And they burst into laughter. It's the most ridiculous thing they've ever heard. And the anthropologists are like completely puzzled. Well, what do you think with? With our bellies, of course. Now that's pretty interesting, because how do you think with, I mean, in our culture, that is so outside our story of what it means to be human. But it's there in our sort of genetic prehistory, because in the late Paleolithic, early Neolithic cultures, the art tells you that, like, here's where the, you know, when we bury someone, there's a headstone to mark the grave. Well, you find Neolithic graves where there is a navel stone, right? Marking the center of being. And what happened, you know, the Neolithic revolution came along. This is where we discovered seeds. And boy, you take a seed and you push your seed into the ground, and you have suddenly divided all of nature. Because suddenly that patch of ground belongs to you. It's no longer the breeding ground of Mother Nature. This is your piece of ground with your seed in it. And suddenly that shoot growing up beside your seed is a weed and has to be exterminated. And that animal coming along is suddenly vermin, because it might eat your plant. And that tree has to be cut down because it's putting your plant into shade. All of nature changes the moment you put a seed into the ground. You're taking control. And as we took control, that center of our thinking began to rise up through the body. In fact, if you look at Homer, there's a word Homer uses over and over, phrene or phrenes. And people, like, there's one book I found about this, but it's really a book that looks at, well, what does phrenes mean, and how many times does it occur in the Iliad and Homer? But you translate phrene into English, and it means two things. It means mind, and it means diaphragm. They felt their mind here. So it's like they're halfway along that migration between the pelvic bowl and the head. They felt their thinking here, and so they understood the mind. That's where they experienced it. And there's a translator, Richmond Lattimore, who preserves that sense. Occasionally he'll have a character say, you know, the mind within my breast understands your words. And it's just such a beautiful thing. And then, of course, we ended up in the head by Plato's time. It turns out that there's an actual anatomical intelligence in the belly. There is a brain in the belly. And that brain, you know, again, speaking about our story, we have resisted this information for decades. So it was discovered in 1908 by Byron Robinson, and he wrote an exquisite anatomical book with drawings, and his book is called The Abdominal and Pelvic Brain. And we sort of forgot about it. And Johannes Langley came along in the 1920s and rediscovered it. It was forgotten. Michael Gerson came along in the 1960s and rediscovered it. And it took him 15 years of presenting findings to his fellow neuroscientists before they capitulated. They said, okay, you're right. By any standard, that intelligence in the belly is a brain. And it's a brain, interestingly, that, you know, its anatomical function is digestion. But that reflects on another level. Because there are such stark differences between the brain in the head and the brain in the pelvic bowl. And it behooves us to understand those differences, because we've grown up in a culture that denies and resists that other part of our intelligence. In general terms, you know, the brain in the cranium excludes, and so it abstracts. The word abstraction just means to pull away from. You pull something out of its context and consider it in isolation. So you're excluding the context. And that exclusion enables us to gain perspective, which requires distance. That enables us to. It's a pleasant little ringtone. Okay, we'll just. All right. They've given up. There you go. That ability to exclude enables us to categorize. This is not a glass. This is a cup. Your exclusion is necessary to systemization. Exclusion is necessary to all of our abstract structures by which we interpret and understand the world. The brain in the head focuses on parts. So analysis means to break into pieces, and that's what it excels at. And that's a great skill to have, but it also helps to come back to wholeness. And that's, you know, the fact that the brain in the belly digests food, and that's its primary function, is reflected in these other cultures that understand the brain in the belly, understand Hara to be the place where integration happens. So if you want to come back to your wholeness, if you want to come back to your deepest truth, if you want to feel your life as a unity, that's where you do it, not in the head. And that ability to come back to wholeness, it's something that happens by feeling. And we think of feeling and thinking as separate, different categories. And they're not. There's no sensation that isn't a form of thought in one way or another. But we demean feeling even as we demean the intelligence in the pelvic bowl. The brain in the head seeks to know the world. It seeks to establish known relationships. The brain in the pelvic bowl seeks to establish felt relationships. It doesn't pin things down. It attunes instead of establishing and fixing. It's how we attune to the present. This denial in our culture of that pelvic intelligence has created what I think of as the primary wound that we all carry within us. And that's a wound between our thinking and our being. So we've been trained to believe that we can think more clearly if we sort of shut down and diminish our awareness of what's happening in the body. You taught that in school, right? You sit in your chair and, you know, you're restless. The teacher says, stop moving and concentrate on the lesson. And so you stifle the body's energy, which is the body's intelligence, and you fill your head with the lesson. I mean, we're taught that, but we're not just taught that once. We're taught that, 6-7 hours a day, 5 days a week, 10 months of the year for 12 years. Over and over and over. And we eventually separate our thinking from our being so that we don't feel our thoughts and we don't recognize sensation as thought. And I mean that quite literally. I tend to feel every thought. I feel it resonating through my being. And I can dissociate that So I can talk to you from a place that doesn't require feeling, and I can say a whole lot of really interesting things, and I'm not feeling a bit of it, and I don't really need to, because I've got all these ideas that I want to get across. That's what happens, sorry for that, but that's what happens when you cut your thinking away from your feeling. That's how we tend to speak to each other. We tend to speak from here. From here. We don't speak from this resonance that runs through the body. And, you know, I encountered the Hara intelligence in Japan, and over years came to reconcile the intelligence in my head with the intelligence in the pelvic bowl. So to bring them into relationships such that you feel every thought, and you recognize every sensation as a form of embodied thinking. And when that happened, as I came to that reconciliation for myself, I began to understand the fantasy that had the adult world around me in its grip. And that fantasy is a denial of wholeness. We as a culture are blind to wholeness. As a culture, we have desensitized ourselves to wholeness. Now, this is important to recognize, because all there is wholeness. It's all there is. Everything depends on everything. Everything leans on everything. Everything affects everything. And you know, you can give lip service to that idea, but there's this thought experiment I encountered in a physics book, where this mathematical physicist speculated, okay, what would happen if we went to the remotest fringe of the universe and eliminated the gravitational field of a single electron? Electron, unthinkably small. Gravity is a weak force, and we're at the remotest fringe of the universe. So I have a magic wand. I wave it, and the gravitational field of one electron at the remotest fringe of the universe disappears. And I've got a magic magnifying glass, so I can follow a molecule through the air in this room. And it goes through about 50 collisions that it would have had, and then suddenly it misses a molecule that it would have hit if I hadn't waved my magic wand. After that moment, and that takes about a second, after that moment, every interaction among the molecules in this room will be different from what it would have been. And if you go outside tomorrow, and there's some turbulence in the atmosphere, you will see cloud formations that are different from what they would have been. You'll feel gusts of wind that are different from what they would have been, because the gravitational field of a single electron in the universe had been eliminated. So to speak of wholeness, you know, if you cannot feel wholeness, you cannot feel reality. And then how can you be in balance with your reality or the world's reality? And that quality of wholeness isn't just around us. It is through us. It is us. It's what we live in. So if wholeness is the nature of reality and you're desensitized to wholeness, you're desensitized to reality. And I look at how that shows up in, not just in my culture, but in every industrialized culture of the world. They are all blind to wholeness. So, you know, you can check this for yourself. Do you feel the wholeness of your life? Do you feel the present as a whole. If you don't feel the present as a whole, you're not feeling the present, because that's all it is the wholeness that holds you in this moment. What does it mean to speak from your wholeness? What does it mean to listen from your wholeness? These things are just crucially important to how we go about our lives as human beings. And we're fixated on the parts. We chase the parts. We take the parts to pieces and know the pieces of the parts, and we are blind to the wholeness that holds us. Wholeness can't be known. There's no way your brain as a part of wholeness can objectively know wholeness. Wholeness has no boundary. Wholeness is always changing. But, you can feel wholeness. You can feel wholeness because at this moment, the whole of the universe is living through you. Just as that electron at the remotest fringe is changing your world and is moving through your body, the effects of it. You can feel wholeness. Now, what that means is that that resource in the pelvic bowl, which is where you feel the world, until we reestablish our relationship with it, until we recognize that to come home to the self is to come home to the pelvic floor. You know, there's so much interest in embodiment, but what we're missing is where to land in the body. And that there is, you know, the pelvic floor, in my experience, is the ground of your being. And to drop your awareness down through the body so that it rests on the pelvic floor is to come into a realm of your consciousness that understands wholeness, that resonates with the clarity of the truth of your life. And the body, you know, the body's intelligence in our culture is so baffled, is so compartmentalized. We separate everything, even as within ourselves, even as we separate everything in the world around us. So, you know, the intelligence of the head is out of relationship with the intelligence of the heart. So we can feel from the heart, and that's lovely, and then we can be analytical, and that's okay too. But it's an either-or choice. These are complementary aspects of our intelligence. They belong together. You know, the heart is out of relationship with the intelligence of the genitals. I mean, there's love and then there's sex. It's funny, when I was a kid, all the movies, like, there was so much romance and like no sex, and now there's so much sex and no romance. It's like they won't come together, right? We live in this binary either or. We've lost our way when it comes to wholeness. We don't know how, because we're trying to put things together with the intelligence of our head, and it specializes at analysis. It will pull anything to pieces, bit by bit by bit, but it's impotent when it comes to bringing things into wholeness. Absolutely impotent. There's this relationship that I feel, and I'm not going to ask you to buy into it, but I do want to speak to it, whereby I feel the intelligence in my head as the male part of my consciousness. And it's abstracting and controlling and brilliant. And I feel the intelligence in my pelvic bowl as the female part of my consciousness. And it comes into felt relationship and attunes and understands wholeness and integrates and integrates. It's inclusive, and this is exclusive. And there's a very interesting, it's like a yin-yang complementarity, whereby the intelligence in the head gains gifts, gains treasures of perspective. And you think about perspective, you require distance to achieve perspective. You're not going to have perspective when you're in the middle of something. You step back from it and you gain perspective. So the intelligence in the head has that ability to step back from the world and gain a distance. But what's happened is we've stayed there. We've stayed at arm's length from the world, and we're gaining perspective and more perspective, and trying to patch those perspectives together into a whole. And that classic, maybe little hackneyed image of the man going down on one knee to offer the ring, asking for the hand of his true love in marriage. There's something about that that clarifies the relationship between this male intelligence in the head and this female intelligence in the pelvic bowl. Because those perspectives, all those perspectives gained by the intelligence of the head, only come into their true value when they're brought down to the body and integrated with your being. And that may sound strange, but the capacity of the pelvic bowl to integrate is limitless. You can offer anything to it, and it will integrate. You can take, it's so contrary to our culture that I almost hesitate to suggest it, but you can take a simple idea. I'll invite you to try this for yourself. And understand, it took us 10,000 years to complete the journey from the pelvic bowl up to the head. So we're going to reverse that journey with a little exercise, if you're up for that. So, excellent. So the first thing to do is to locate the pelvic floor. Now, the easiest way to do that is really contravenes our culture because it's down amongst all those areas we're really not supposed to talk about, even though they are part of what make us human. So the perineum is the very center of the pelvic floor. And you can locate the perineum because it's the muscle you use when you stop yourself from peeing. It's that little muscle down there that you just gently lift. That's the perineum. So imagine a spaciousness rising up from the pelvic floor all the way to the head. And I'll invite you to entertain in the head some simple phrase that you have no particular attachment to. The grass is green. Snow is cold. The sun is bright. Fire is hot. The flower is red. Whatever. Some very simple idea. And hold that idea in your head and notice how that feels. Notice how it shows up for you. And then give it permission to begin to drop down through the body. And you'll actually feel that phrase begin to slide down towards the perineum. And you'll feel it sliding down. And as it slides down, it may need to change in some way. And be patient with it. And be gentle with it. And you feel that phrase slide down. And if you're gentle enough with it, you'll find it will travel all the way down to land on the perineum. And notice how it feels there when you've truly brought it to rest on the perineum. How does that feel? And just be with that for a minute. And allow it to live there for a few seconds. And again, it's asking a lot of you because it's absolutely the opposite of the way our culture goes. But I'd love to ask, was anyone able to complete that journey? And if so, did it change? And if so, in what way?
So my phrase was, roses are red. And it showed up as a rose, a single stemmed rose. And as it traveled through, the stem had to go because of the thorns. And it ended up as a single leaf on it. So the petals came away and then ended up as a single leaf in my pelvis area.
And
A single, not leaf, but
petal.
petal.
Yeah. And
it felt like it was home.
There.
Yeah.
So, in general, in the head, it's like, well, it's in a realm of abstraction. So it's like an idea. Mm-hmm. And as it travels down through the body, it becomes a felt reality in some way. It becomes an experience. Did anyone else have an experience with that they might be willing to share? Yeah, please.
I used your image of the fire as hot, and it was very interesting because in the head, it was something that I was looking at. It was a visual image.
Yeah.
And as it moved down, it became. Well, I noticed that my whole abdominal and expanded. I mean, things got bigger and more resonant. But then there was the feeling, the actual feeling of warmth. It wasn't like, ooh, it's burning, but,
yes.
But to be able to actually feel to feel it.
Yeah.
So it made a much more complete and resonant experience.
Yeah, so.
Very interesting. That's a really interesting exercise.
Yeah, so what we've done is we've traversed the wound between our thinking and our being. We've carried a thought which we tend to keep separate. We keep our thoughts unintegrated, and we bring that down and bring it into contact with your being, and the thought converts in a way to a sensitivity, to a feeling, to a felt experience. Yeah, so the fact that the thought converts to a sensitivity might seem like a, well, so what? Because sensitivity in our culture is kind of down the ladder of things that matter. The reason it's down the ladder from things that matter is that we have defined our intelligence with the intelligence of the head. And it just happens to have defined our intelligence in a way that's flattering to itself. Right? What is intelligence? You give someone an IQ test. What are you testing? You're testing their ability to reason in an abstract fashion. So we say, well, that's intelligence. The ability to reason in an abstract fashion. Well, that's like this tiny bandwidth on a massive spectrum of human intelligence. And when I try to name that spectrum, I start by calling it sensitivity. And I don't care if it's a sensitivity to a child's tears, to bird song, to color, to a petal from a rose, to arithmetic relationship. Any sensitivity is a form of intelligence. Now that sensitivity requires a complementary opposite, because sensitivity is reactive. If my retina didn't react to light, I wouldn't see. Sensitivity is reactive. So that reactivity needs to be grounded in order to make coherent the information that it's accessing. And that grounding happens in the body. And, you know, as a culture, we are very, 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 very clever. And we have forgotten how to live intelligently. And once you understand intelligence, that the nature of your intelligence is grounded sensitivity, you know, you can begin to look back on your life and see how that has been stripped away from you. And as you're desensitized and left ungrounded, your ability to feel wholeness is diminishing. Right? Wholeness, you can't achieve wholeness. You've already got it. You can't escape it. It's reality. It's what we're embedded in. You are whole. You are embedded inextricably in wholeness. So you can't achieve it, but you can't lose it. But you can desensitize yourself to it. You can get to the point where you can no longer feel wholeness. And then the issue is how to resensitize yourself to wholeness, how to recover that. And I think of that sensitivity, that embodied sensitivity that is our birthright. I think of it almost like a bell. And you can take a bell and tap it, and it will ring in that pure tone. And you can stuff that bell with cotton balls, and ding, ding, it just loses its resonance. To me, that's a metaphor for our bodies, because our bodies ring to the present. And that grounded sensitivity of our native intelligence has been vivisected. It's been cut up and compartmentalized. And it's like we've stuffed the bell full of cotton balls. And so the present, ding, ding, we no longer ring to the present. And when you no longer feel something, it stops existing for you. Supersonic sounds, the echolocation of bats doesn't exist for us. We don't hear it. Similarly, when the body is consolidated in that way, such that the present can no longer ring it, it stops existing. It becomes this shattered reality of pieces that you're trying to sort and organize with the intelligence in your head. In this fantasy that our culture is gathered around, this denial of wholeness, what we've attached to is the idea of independence. We strive for independence. We feel independent. We declare our independence. And there's no such thing. I mean, just show me one example of independence in the universe. Anywhere. No, everything leans on everything. Everything affects everything. There's no such thing as independence. But we shore up this idea that there is independence. The entire story of our culture is devoted to this fantasy of independence. There's so many ways of looking at that issue, like our very being. We speak of the mind and the body as these two different things, and then we realize, oh no, they're not two different things. It's just that we've split, the mind body. We've got this mind body split we're dealing with. Even that is nonsense. It's nonsense because it suggests that there's such a thing as a mindless body. And the body is a river of intelligence. Every cell participates in its thought. There's a brain in the belly. There's, the only place you'll find a mindless body is in a morgue, right? And yet we've got this idea that somehow the mind and the body have been divided. It's not a division of mind and body we suffer from. It's a division of mind and mind. Like in that sense, we're a schizophrenic culture. Because this intelligence of the body that is so deeply connected to the mindful present has been cut away from the intelligence of the head. Our thinking and our being have been sundered. It shows up. If you really want to look respectable, you get dressed up in a nice shirt with a tie, and the knot is just right. And that knot, that necktie, symbolizes a tacit promise to keep the body's impulses in check and govern with reason. We're going to be reasonable here because we've got a tie on, and that tie is the tourniquet that symbolizes the division between our thinking and our being. And then people are relieved, when somebody comes in wearing a tie, because order is going to be maintained. And even just loosening the tie symbolizes a loosening of that pledge to keep them separate. But you realize our whole world is run by people wearing this pledge to keep their thinking and their being separate. But even the way we design our homes, we want our home, to be in this boundary of independence. And boy, you know where your property boundary is, and you put up a fence, and you've got the space between that and your home, and then your home has all these little rooms with locks on the door inside. Well, we build our homes that way because that's how our bodies are. It feels familiar to us. We like to have that boundary around the self. We have our energies bound and compartmentalized within the body. So it feels familiar and right to be in a house that's all chopped up in the same way. I think of Japanese homes I've been in. You slide a screen to create a room, but it's just an open space. And then you want a room, we'll slide these paper screens into place. Not 2x4s with soundproofing and 5/8 drywall on it, paper screens. And you slide the door to your room open, and there's nature. Right? It's just there. There's a sense of permeability. The world flows through a Japanese house. The world is shut out of a Western house. And that independence that we need, you stand in a condo and you look down the hall, and it's just this row of identical doors. And every space is sealed. Now you could put a window between the hall and the room. And then you could maybe walk by the hall and say, oh, look, John and Mary are home. And there's a relationship. But no, we don't want relationship. We want to be taken out of relationship. We want independence. A car, we're in love with the car because you climb inside a car and you are sitting inside a steel head on wheels. And it's got 2 headlights because we've got 2 eyes. And even though 3 headlights would illuminate the road more effectively, it's got to be 2 because otherwise it wouldn't be a head. And we need to be inside that head the way we live inside our own heads. It proliferates. It's embedded in our language. Headquarters, where the head lives, it's in charge, right? The capital city, head, capital means head, is in charge. CEO, chief executive officer. The word chief comes from a Latin word that means head. Any organization in our culture, any hierarchy has a leader, and the leader is the head. Even of the church. Here's an institution based on faith. And, you could call the head of the church the lungs of the church. Because breath and spirit are the same word. You could call the head of the church the heart of the church. But no, in our culture, it must be the head. The head has to rule everything. And we contract our world, not just into ourselves, but into the cranium. And we live there and wonder why our lives feel congested and confined. But there's more to it than that. There's this whole, the very way in which we define our world is in terms of separation. So what do I mean by that? It's, well, we've got, for example, the world, we map out the world in 4 dimensions, right? Length, width, height, and time. Time is the 4th dimension. Every one of those dimensions emphasizes separation. I'm 10 feet from you. That was 2 days ago, right? This side of the music stand is 1.5 feet from the other side. It's how far apart things are. It's all about separation. It underscores things being independent. And that's how we define our world. And the world, we try to contain reality within those dimensions, and it leaks out of them over and over. I mentioned the theater company, the Garrett Theater, I was involved with. So John Herbert, he was an extraordinary man. He was 8 or 9 years old at school one day, in the middle of a class. The teacher was in the middle of a lesson. He stood up from his chair, ran out of the room, ran out of the school, and all the way home to burst in the back door to find his mother in a pool of blood. And she looked up at him and she said, "Thank God you came, Jack. I prayed you would." Now, how do you begin to describe that in terms of our 4 dimensions? You can't. There's nothing, there's no connection between Jack, this boy, sitting in an English class at school, and his mother suffering a hemorrhage at home. But they were connected. So there is a dimension that is missing in our 4 dimensions. And it's the dimension in which everything is in contact with everything else at all times. And it's the reality that we find in quantum mechanics. And it's the reality we find in, there's a great book by Larry Dossey called One Mind. And he quantum mechanics points to this relationship, this association, this equivalence almost between mind and matter. Where at the quantum level, you observe something, you change it. You observe a photon, or you observe a wave of light, and it changes from a wave into a photon. And that happens even backwards in time. There's a brilliant physicist, John Wheeler, who devised the delayed choice experiment. It's infallible. So there is a dimension to our reality in which we live, a dimension that lives within us. I think of it as mind. I mean, think of it how you will. But there's an explorer, a journalist, who had an experience in the Amazon jungle where he was actually, he ended up in this village by accident. This Stone Age village, nobody there had contact with Europeans. They didn't know any language that he knew, and vice versa. And he began talking with one of the chiefs there. They shared thoughts, and it saved his life. And so he coined our dimensions, the space-time mind continuum. That kind of sits well with me. To exclude the mind is to exclude the very dimension that holds our world in wholeness. But again, we're whole blind. We've turned against wholeness. There's another really interesting aspect to our denial of wholeness, which shows up in our relationship to the body. We have 5 senses. I mean, a human being is born with 5 senses. It's axiomatic to us. It's obvious, and we all know what those 5 senses are, until you realize that our 5 senses are a cultural artifact. You go to other cultures, they have a completely different understanding of senses, a different experience of senses. My favorite example is a tribe in Africa called the Anglo-Ewe tribe. And, for example, their primary sense is a sense of balance. And you think, well, that's kind of interesting because we speak about a sense of balance. We have an organ devoted to balance. Why don't we include balance as a sense? And there's a really specific reason for that. There's something that all of our 5 senses have in common. They all involve a stimulus from the outside world crossing the boundary of the self and arriving on a sensor that transmits a message to the brain. So whether it's sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, every sense we validate upholds the idea of a boundary, of our independence. And within the shell of our independence, the world occasionally creates a stimulus that tells us about it. Balance is not like that at all. Balance is a felt relationship. I am born feeling the earth. I feel the earth even in the amniotic fluid of my mother. I'm in a felt relationship with the earth, and there's no stimulus receptor. There's this felt relationship. So balance does not uphold a sense of my independence. It's a threat. So we don't include it as a sense. And you look at the Anglo-Ewe understanding, experience of the senses. Their broad term is sesilalame. And sesilalame is a word that has been translated as feel at flesh inside. Feel at flesh inside. The Anglo-Ewe feel everything within the body. So they don't just see the world with their eyes, they feel the sights of the world in their body. And you go back to that image of the body's intelligence like a bell that resonates to the world around it. And you begin to get a sense of how your intelligence can resonate to the sights of the world. They feel the sounds of the world in their body. And they have a different word that means just to hear with the ear, but that's not real hearing. Real hearing happens within the realm of sesilalame. And I mean, they have speech is a sense. Speech is a sense. And the anthropologist, Catherine Lynn Geertz, is the anthropologist who went and studied them. And I heard her on the radio talking about this, trying to get a sense in conversation of their sensorium. So this guy says, and of course speech is a sense. And she says, oh, hang on a minute. I don't think I've described what I mean by a sense. So she goes over what she means by a sense again. He said, yes, and speech is a sense. Oh, let me try once more. I mean, speech is a delivery system as we understand it, as we experience it. A sense is receiving. How can speech be a sense? Well, they experience speech physically. It has an energy to it. And when you think about our use of speech, we believe that our job when we're speaking is to deliver our ideas, to deliver our information. And that's just not my experience at all. When I launch into a sentence, I don't know what the last word of that sentence is going to be. I don't know where that sentence is going to take me. Right? Each phrase, each word of the sentence is sort of illuminating the next step. And it's like I'm moving through the dark towards this half-sensed conclusion or realization. And the words are what enable me to find my way. The words enable me to find my way. So just as, if I'm in a dark room, the sense of touch enables me to find my way. Words are a sense that enables me to navigate and find my way. But we are so used to, we present ourselves, we present our ideas, we present our opinions, and we move into what I call presentation mode at a very, very young age. So, as children, each one of us learned in one way or another that the whole of our being, the wholeness of our being, is unacceptable. The wholeness of our being is too noisy, is too demanding, is too active, is too whatever. And as a child, as an infant, you crave love, you crave approval, and you learn how to present yourself to elicit that approval. And we grow up attached to how to present ourselves, how to present our ideas, and it's a choice you've got. You can either be in presentation mode or you can be present. But you can't have it both ways because presence requires receptivity. If you're present to another person, you are fully receptive to them in this moment, even as you're speaking. If I'm not receptive, I can talk at you and not really receive anything, and that's a whole different thing. It just feels awful. But if I open my receptivity, every one of you is informing the way the sentence falls from my body, the way it's shaped as it moves forward. Receptivity and presence are so closely intertwined that I don't have the skill to disentangle them. They're like two sides of a coin. If I'm fully present to you, I'm fully receptive to you. If I'm fully receptive to you, I'm fully present to you. And that quality of receptivity is a quality of wholeness. And we're taught that our job is to give and give and give and give. And you may give as a child to a parent, as a parent to a child, as a sibling, as a coworker, as a neighbor, as a community member, as an employee, as a coworker. There's so many ways in which you're triggered to give, and you know what you need to give. And when in our culture are we given permission to just receive? And the abundance of the present is always there to just receive. And as we receive it, we're informed and carried by it. but it's a violation. Receptivity in that manner is a violation of the boundary that we're taught to uphold and feel the self within. There is no independence of the self. I can construct an independent self and decide, well, these are my values and this is what I know about the world, and I can construct an independent self. But then I've got a choice again. I can be who I know myself to be, or I can be present. Again, you can't have it both ways, because you discover yourself through the present. You don't discover who you are by diving inside like reaching into a purse with gold coins. That's not where your truth is. Your truth is in relationship, which shows up another limitation of our whole blindness. As a culture, we've come to believe that knowledge will save us. And that's like a current running through each one of us. Knowledge will save us. And so you check the iPhone, you check the newspaper, you get knowledge, and you further knowledge. So you look at that assumption and you give it the tiniest little prick, and it dissolves. Because if knowledge could save us, then as a species, we'd have it made, right? Relative to 2,000 years ago. And the reality is, we have pushed the very systems on which our lives depend to the point that they are unraveling. So knowledge, it turns out, is lethal. Because every threat our ecosystems face are the result of knowledge. The acidification of the oceans and the heating up of the oceans. We know how to burn fossil fuels. We know how to make toxins. We know how to make plastics. We know how to make electricity from radiation. And Chernobyl happens. Right? So we know how to make antibiotics, and now, we use them with such generosity that we're coming to the end of the antibiotic era. So knowledge is lethal if it's not counterbalanced by self-knowledge. But again, we've turned self-knowledge into a kind of knowledge. We've objectified it. So, well, this is who I am, the constructed self. These are my favorite shows on TV, and this is my favorite color, and these are my friends, and these are my values, and that's who I am. Self-knowledge is something completely different. Knowledge is a self-centered understanding of the world, objective knowledge. You possess it, you grasp it, you accumulate it. Knowledge has that self-centered quality to it, and it gives you a certain leverage over the world around you. Self-knowledge is something completely different. I discover who I am by coming into a relationship. I come into a relationship with a kid playing with chalk on the sidewalk. And as I come into felt relationship with that child, I'm illuminated in a particular way. I come into felt relationship with a tree, and I actually feel that living being there, and I'm illuminated in a particular way. The more deeply I come into felt relationship with the world around me, the more who I am is illuminated for me. So self-knowledge, in that sense, is a world-centered understanding of the self. And it violates, self-knowledge again, violates that independence that our culture clings to. There's a really interesting thing about independence. If you look at mythology, if you look at especially Joseph Campbell's understanding of world mythology. Joseph Campbell characterized the tyrant as the man of self-achieved independence. And you think about that phrase, and you think, that sounds pretty good. Self-achieved independence. I mean, bring it on, right? That is the American dream. Self-achieved independence, to have millions or even billions and your own private island where you're responsible to nothing and you're out of relationship with the world. You can control every relationship. That's the dream that gnaws at us. And the terminus of that dream, the logical outcome of that dream, is Howard Hughes, who was a brilliant aviator, who ended up at the end of his life, he was a billionaire before there was such a thing. At the end of his life, he ends up alone in a room with only 3 other people he trusts. He doesn't touch anything without using a Kleenex because he's afraid of germs. And he's descended into madness. Because when you come out of relationship with the world, all that you're left with is fantasy. It's all you have left. Joseph Campbell talked about the hero as the man of self-achieved submission. Self-achieved submission. So it's not submission that is forced on you by anyone. It is your willingness to submit. Submit to what? Submit to the present. Submit to the whole. Submit to what is. Submit to reality. And that requires an undoing. That requires a gentle releasing of the cotton balls that have compartmentalized and stifled and congested us, so that once more the present can ring us and we can accord with its harmonies. And all those things, those qualities we most yearn for in our lives, you yearn to be touched by grace. You yearn for peace of heart. You yearn for a sense of spaciousness. You yearn for harmony, to get out of the chaos and feel harmony. But all of those qualities we yearn for belong to the present. We can't possess them. The present is utterly at peace. The present moves with infinite grace. The present is always in harmony. The present is spacious beyond imagining. And to join the present is to join those qualities and partake of them. Not because you own them or possess them or you've achieved them. It's that self-achieved surrender that enables you to partake of them. And wholeness, I believe that as a culture, and this can only start as individuals, that what this agony and turmoil of our times is asking of us is to begin to orient our lives towards wholeness. And that requires a questioning of everything we've been handed as a given. We've defined everything independent of wholeness. We've defined success independent of wholeness. You know what success is, and you go for it, and if wholeness has to take a hit, collateral damage, what does it matter? Look at my bank account. We sacrifice our sense of wholeness to be successful. Well, how can you win with a dichotomy like that set up for you? And there are other ways of orienting your lives, and there's so much value in it. You can organize your life. You can say what matters is compassion, or what matters is a sense of peace, or what matters is courage, or I mean, countless honor. You can go on and on. But each one of those characteristics, you know what they look like. You know what compassion looks like. You know what peace looks like. And that, so it runs a risk that the moment will come when you say, oh, I should be compassionate here. Oh, or I'm going to find peace here. As soon as that happens, you're in a divided state. Because there's the part of you that knows what this looks like and knows how to bring the rest of you along. We supervise, we sit in our heads and we try to supervise our way into wholeness. And it can't be done. Wholeness is different. I don't know what wholeness looks like. When I surrender to my wholeness, I have no idea where it's going to take me, but it takes me someplace new every time. So it's not a destination. It's a surrender to what is that's modeled for us by the hero of mythology. And as we orient ourselves to wholeness, the possibility of coming into harmony with the world around us becomes real for the first time in a long time. And that's what my new book is about. Yeah.